Hello, and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of The City and the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke. Our hero Alvin has escaped from Lys with a robot companion he picked up in the mysterious abandoned fortress of Shalmarain. He's now back in Diaspar and finds a farewell message from his partner in crime, if it was a crime, the jester Kedron. This message ends, "Goodbye, Alvin. I had thought of giving you some advice, but I do not suppose you would take it. You will go your own way, as you always have, and your friends will be tools to use or discard as occasion suits. That is all. I can think of nothing more to say." For a moment, Kedron, the Kedron who no longer existed, save as a pattern of electric charges in the memory cells of the city, looked at Alvin with resignation and, it seemed, with sadness. Then the screen was blank again. Alvin remained motionless for a long time after the image of Kedron had faded. He was searching his soul as he had seldom done before in all his life, for he could not deny the truth of much that Kedron had said. When had he paused in all his schemes and adventures to consider the effect of what he was doing upon any of his friends? He had brought anxiety to them and might soon bring worse, all because of his insatiable curiosity and the urge to discover what should not be known. He had never been fond of Kedron. The jester's astringent personality prevented any close relationship, even if Alvin had desired it. Yet now he thought of Kedron's parting words and was shaken with remorse. Because of his actions, the jester had fled from this age into the unknown future. But surely, thought Alvin, he had no need to blame himself for that. It proved only what he had already known, that Kedron was a coward. Perhaps he was no more of a coward than anyone else in Diaspar. He had the additional misfortune of possessing a powerful imagination. Alvin could accept some responsibility for his fate, but by no means all. Whom else in Diaspar had he harmed or distressed? He thought of Jesserac, his tutor, who had been patient with what must have been his most difficult pupil. He remembered all the little kindnesses that his parents had shown him over the years. Now that he looked back upon it, there were more than he had imagined. And he thought of Illustra. She had loved him, and he had taken that love or ignored it as he chose. Yet what else was he to have done? Would she have been any happier had he spurned her completely? He understood now why he had never loved Illustra, nor any of the women he had known in Diaspar. That was another lesson that Lys had taught him. Diaspar had forgotten many things, and among them was the true meaning of love. In Airlie, he had watched the mothers dandle their children on their knees, and he himself had felt that protective tenderness for all small and helpless creatures that is love's unselfish twin. Yet now there was no woman in Diaspar who knew or cared for what had once been the final aim of love. There were no real emotions, no deep passions in the immortal city. Perhaps such things only thrived because of their very transience, because they could not last forever and lay always under the shadow which Diaspar had banished. That was the moment, if such a moment ever existed, when Alvin realized what his destiny must be. Until now, he had been the unconscious agent of his own impulses. If he could have known so archaic an analogy, he might have compared himself to a rider on a runaway horse. It had taken him to many strange places, and might do so again, but in its wild galloping it had shown him its powers, and taught him where he really wished to go. Alvin's reverie was rudely interrupted by the chimes of the wall screen. The timbre of the sound told him at once that this was no incoming call, but that someone had arrived to see him. He gave the admission signal, and a moment later was facing Jesserac. His tutor looked grave, but not unfriendly. "I have been asked to take you to the council, Alvin," he said. "It is waiting to hear you." Then Jesserac saw the robot and examined it curiously. "So this is the companion you have brought back from your travels. I think it had better come with us." This suited Alvin very well. The robot had already extricated him from one dangerous situation, and he might have to call upon it again. He wondered what the machine had thought about the adventures and vicissitudes in which he had involved it, and wished for the 1,000th time that he could understand what was going on inside its closely shuttered mind. Alvin had the impression that for the moment it had decided to watch, analyze, and draw its own conclusions, doing nothing of its own volition until it had judged the time was ripe. Then, perhaps quite suddenly, it might decide to act, and what it chose to do might not suit Alvin's plans. The only ally he possessed was bound to him by the most tenuous ties of self-interest, and might desert him at any moment. Alystra was waiting for them on the ramp that led out into the street. Even if Alvin had wished to blame her for whatever part she played in the revealing of his secret, he did not have the heart to do so. Her distress was too obvious, and her eyes brimmed with tears as she ran up to greet him. "Ah, Alvin," she cried, "what are they going to do with you?" Alvin took her hands in his with a tenderness that surprised them both. "Don't worry, Alystra," he said. "Everything is going to be all right. After all, at the very worst, the council can only send me back into the memory banks, and somehow I don't think that will happen." Her beauty and her unhappiness were so appealing that even now Alvin felt his body responding to her presence after its old fashion. But it was the lure of the body alone. He did not disdain it, but it was no longer enough. Gently he disengaged his hands and turned to follow Jesserac toward the council chamber. Alystra's heart was lonely, but no longer bitter as she watched him go. She knew now that she had not lost him, for he had never belonged to her. And with the acceptance of that knowledge, she had begun to put herself beyond the power of vain regrets. Alvin scarcely noticed the curious or horrified glances of his fellow citizens as he and his retinue made their way through the familiar streets. He was marshalling the arguments he might have to use and arranging his story in the form most favorable to himself. From time to time he assured himself that he was not in the least alarmed and that he was still master of the situation. They waited only a few minutes in the anteroom, but it was long enough for Alvin to wonder why, if he was unafraid, his legs felt so curiously weak. The only time he had known this sensation before was when he had forced himself up the last slopes of that distant hill in Liss, where Hilvar had shown him the waterfall from whose summit they had seen the explosion of light that had drawn them to Shalmoraine. He wondered what Hilvar was doing now, and if they would ever meet again. It was suddenly very important to him that they should. The great doors dilated, and he followed Jesserac into the council chamber. The 20 members were already seated around their crescent-shaped table, and Alvin felt flattered as he noticed that there were no empty places. This must be the first time for many centuries that the entire council had been gathered together without a single absention. Its rare meetings were usually a complete formality, all ordinary business being dealt with by a few phone calls and, if necessary, an interview between the president and the central computer. Alvin knew by sight most of the members of the council and felt reassured by the presence of so many familiar faces. Like Jesserac, they did not seem unfriendly, merely anxious and puzzled. They were, after all, reasonable men. They might be annoyed that someone had proved them wrong, but Alvin did not believe they would bear him any resentment. Once that would have been a very rash assumption. But human nature had improved in some respects. They would give him a fair hearing, but what they thought was not all important. His judge would not be the council. It would be the central computer. Chapter 16. There were no formalities. The president declared the meeting open and then turned to Alvin. "Alvin," he said kindly enough, "we would like you to tell us what happened to you since you disappeared 10 days ago." The use of the word disappeared, thought Alvin, was highly significant. Even now, the council was reluctant to admit that he had really gone outside Diaspar. He wondered if they knew that there had been strangers in the city, and rather doubted it. In that event, they would have shown considerably more alarm. He told his story clearly and without any dramatics. It was strange and unbelievable enough to their ears and needed no embellishment. Only at one place did he depart from strict accuracy, for he said nothing about the manner of his escape from Lys. It seemed more than likely that he might want to use the same method again. It was fascinating to watch the way in which the attitude of the council members altered during the course of his narrative. At first they were skeptical, refusing to accept the denial of all that they had believed, the violation of their deepest prejudices. When Alvin told them of his passionate desire to explore the world beyond the city and his irrational conviction that such a world did exist, they stared at him as if he was some strange and incomprehensible animal. To their minds, indeed, he was. But finally they were compelled to admit that he had been right and that they had been mistaken. As Alvin's story unfolded, any doubts they may have had slowly dissolved. They might not like what he had told them, but they could no longer deny its truth. If they felt tempted to do so, they had only to look at Alvin's silent companion. There was only one aspect of his tale that roused their indignation, and that was not directed toward him. A buzz of annoyance went round the chamber as Alvin explained the anxiety of Lys to avoid contamination with Diaspar, and the steps that Serranus had taken to prevent such a catastrophe. The city was proud of its culture, and with good reason. That anyone should regard them as inferiors was more than the council members could tolerate. Alvin was very careful not to give offense in anything he said. He wanted, as far as possible, to win the council to his side. Throughout, he tried to give the impression that he had seen nothing wrong in what he had done, and that he expected praise rather than censure for his discoveries. It was the best policy he could have adopted, for it disarmed most of his would-be critics in advance. It also had the effect, though he had not intended this, of transferring any blame to the vanished Kedron. Alvin himself, it was clear to his listeners, was too young to see any danger in what he was doing. The jester, however, should certainly have known better, and should have acted throughout in a more responsible fashion. They did not yet know how fully Kedron himself agreed with them. Gesserac, as Alvin's tutor, was also deserving of some censure, and from time to time several of the counselors gave him thoughtful glances. He did not seem to mind, though he was perfectly well aware of what they were thinking. There was a certain honor in having instructed the most original mind to have come into Diaspar since the Dawn Ages, and nothing could rob Gesserac of that. Not until Alvin had finished the factual account of his adventures did he attempt a little persuasion. Somehow he would have to convince these men of the truths that he had learned in Lys, but how could he make them really understand something that they had never seen and could hardly imagine? "It seems a great tragedy," he said, "that the two surviving branches of the human race should have become separated for such an enormous period of time. One day, perhaps, we may know how it happened, but it is more important now to repair the break, to prevent it happening again. When I was in Lys, I protested against their view that they were superior to us. They may have much to teach us, but we also have much to teach them. If we both believe we have nothing to learn from the other, is it not obvious that we will both be wrong?" He looked expectantly along the line of faces and was encouraged to go on. "Our ancestors," he continued, "built an empire which reached to the stars. Men came and went at will among all those worlds, and now their descendants are afraid to stir beyond the walls of their city. Shall I tell you why?" He paused. There was no movement at all in the great bare room. "It is because we are afraid. afraid of something that happened at the beginning of history. I was told the truth in Lys, though I guessed it long ago. Must we always hide like cowards in Diaspar, pretending that nothing else exists because 1 billion years ago the invaders drove us back to Earth? He'd put his finger on their secret fear, the fear which he had never shared and whose power he could therefore never fully understand. Now let them do what they pleased. He had spoken the truth as he saw it. The president looked at him gravely. "Have you anything more to say," he asked, "before we consider what is to be done?" "Only one thing. I would like to take this robot to the central computer." "But why? You know that the computer is already aware of everything that has happened in this room." "I still wish to go," replied Alvin, politely but stubbornly. "I ask permission both of the council and of the computer." Before the president could reply, a clear, calm voice sounded through the chamber. Alvin had never heard it before in his life, but he knew what it was that spoke. The information machines, which were no more than outlying fragments of this great intelligence, could speak to men, but they did not possess this unmistakable accent of wisdom and authority. "Let him come to me," said the central computer. Alvin looked at the president. It was to his credit that he did not attempt to exploit his victory. He merely asked, "Have I permission to leave?" The president looked around the council chamber, saw no disagreement there, and replied a little helplessly, "Very well. The proctors will accompany you and will bring you back here when we have finished our discussion." Alvin gave a slight bow of thanks. The great doors expanded before him, and he walked slowly out of the chamber. Jesserac had accompanied him, and when the doors had closed once more, he turned to face his tutor. "What do you think the council will do now?" he asked anxiously. Jesserac smiled. "Impatient as ever, aren't you?" he said. "I do not know what my guess is worth, but I imagine they will decide to seal the tomb of Yarlan Zay so that no one can ever make that journey again. Then Diaspar can continue as before, undisturbed by the outside world." "That was what I was afraid of," said Alvin bitterly. "And you still hope to prevent it?" Alvin did not at once reply. He knew that Jesserac had read his intentions, but at least his tutor could not foresee his plans, for he had none. He had come to the stage when he could only improvise and meet each new situation as it arose. "Do you blame me?" he said presently, and Jesserac was surprised by the new note in his voice. It was a hint of humility, the barest suggestion that for the first time Alvin sought the approval of his fellow men. Jesserac was touched by it, but he was too wise to take it very seriously. Alvin was under a considerable strain, and it would be unsafe to assume that any improvement in his character was permanent. "That is a very hard question to answer," said Jesserac slowly. "I am tempted to say that all knowledge is valuable, and it cannot be denied that you have added much to our knowledge. But you have also added to our dangers, and in the long run, which will be more important? How often have you stopped to consider that?" For a moment, master and pupil regarded each other pensively, each perhaps seeing the other's point of view more clearly than ever before in his life. Then, with one impulse, they turned together down the long passage from the council chamber, with their escort still following patiently in the rear. This world, Alvin knew, had not been made for man. Under the glare of the fierce blue lights, so dazzling that they pained the eyes, the long, broad corridors seemed to stretch to infinity. Down these great passageways the robots of Diaspar must come and go throughout their endless lives, yet not once in centuries did they echo to the sound of human feet. Here was the underground city, the city of machines without which Diaspar could not exist. A few hundred yards ahead, the corridor would open into a circular chamber more than a mile across, its roof supported by great columns that must also bear the unimaginable weight of power center. Here, according to the maps, the central computer brooded eternally over the fate of Diaspar. The chamber was there, and it was even vaster than Alvin had dared to imagine. But where was the computer? Somehow he had expected to meet a single huge machine, naive though he knew that conception was. The tremendous but meaningless panorama beneath him made him pause in wonder and uncertainty. The corridor along which they had come ended high in the wall of the chamber, surely the largest cavity ever built by man, and on either side long ramps swept down to the distant floor. Covering the whole of that brilliantly lit expanse were hundreds of great white structures, so unexpected that for a moment Alvin thought he must be looking down upon a subterranean city. The impression was startlingly vivid, and it was one he never wholly lost. Nowhere at all was the sight he had expected, the familiar gleam of metal, which since the beginning of time man had learned to associate with his servants. Here was the end of an evolution almost as long as man's. Its beginnings were lost in the mists of the Dawn Ages, when humanity had first learned the use of power and sent its noisy engines clanking about the world. Steam, water, wind, all had been harnessed for a little while and then abandoned. For centuries, the energy of matter had run the world until it too had been superseded, and with each change the old machines were forgotten and the new ones took their place. Very slowly, over thousands of years, the ideal of the perfect machine was approached, that ideal which had once been a dream, then a distant prospect, and at last a reality. No machine may contain any moving parts. Here was the ultimate expression of that ideal. Its achievement had taken man perhaps 100 million years, and in the moment of his triumph, he had turned his back upon the machine forever. It had reached finality, and thenceforth could sustain itself eternally while serving him. Alvin no longer asked himself which of these silent white presences was the central computer. He knew that it comprised them all, and that it extended far beyond this chamber, including within its being all the countless other machines in Diaspar, whether they were mobile or motionless. As his own brain was the sum of many billion separate cells arrayed through a volume of space a few inches across, so the physical elements of the central computer were scattered throughout the length and breadth of Diaspar. This chamber might hold no more than the switching system whereby all these dispersed units kept in touch with one another. Uncertain where to go next, Alvin stared down the great sweeping ramps and across the silent arena. The central computer must know that he was here, as it knew everything that happened in Diaspar. He could only wait for instructions. The now familiar yet still awe-inspiring voice was so quiet and so close to him that he did not believe that his escort could also hear it. "Go down the left-hand ramp," it said. "I will direct you from there." He walked slowly down the slope, the robot floating above him. Neither Jesserac nor the proctors followed. He wondered if they had received orders to remain here, or whether they had decided that they could supervise him just as well from their vantage point without the bother of making this long descent. Or perhaps they had come as close to the central shrine of Diaspar as they cared to approach. And we will follow Alvin further into that central shrine next time.